When is a nation above international law? An 11th-hour ruling from the European Court of Human Rights for now halting the maiden flight in a scheme to deport illegal migrants from Britain to Rwanda. Despite outcry that extends all the way up to Prince Charles and the Archbishop of Canterbury, the UK government vows to fight the ruling with hints at a review of its relationship with the ECHR. Is this the same Britain which prides itself as a birthplace of modern law, a bastion of liberal values and democracy, which calls for Russia to be brought to international justice over its invasion and plunder of Ukraine? It begs the broader question, amid the backlash against globalization, what's allowed in the name of sovereignty and national interest? As the UK government tables a bill to override the same Northern Ireland protocol it signed with Brussels as part of the post-Brexit trade deal, what future for international treaties? What future for international law? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking about the UK's moves to get around that ECHR ruling. With us, Laura Carter, lecturer in British history at the University of Paris Cité.
Good evening.
Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Thanks as well to journalist and commentator Maximilian Jarrett, editorial consultant at the newsletter Africa Confidential. How are you, sir?
I'm very well, Francois.
We welcome Connor Tomlinson, head of research at the British Conservation Alliance, which advocates for free market solutions to climate change. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And we hope to be joined by law professor Holger Hestermeyer soon, co-director of the Centre for International Governance and Dispute Resolution at King's College London. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, #F24debate. All options remain on the table, says the UK government spokesperson. This as Tory backbenchers openly call on Britain to quit that European Court of Human Rights. Jenny Shin has more on the fallout from Tuesday's ruling.
Just hours before takeoff, the UK's first flight to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda grounded following an intervention by the ECHR, European Court of Human Rights. But Boris Johnson's government is already on track to prepare the next one.
This government will not be deterred from doing the right thing. We will not be put off by the inevitable legal last-minute challenges, nor we will allow mobs, Madam Deputy Speaker, to block removals.
Under a deal signed with Rwanda in April, the UK would send illegal migrants to the African country where their asylum claims would be processed. But on Tuesday, the ECHR, to which the UK is a signatory, granted an emergency measure to one of the men on the flight list, on the grounds that he would not have access to fair legal procedures to determine his refugee status. Rwanda, meanwhile, remains open to receiving asylum seekers sent their way.
The fact that these migrants have not come is a loss to the country and the general public, because their livelihoods would have benefited us by working together.
The legal battle has sparked fierce debate on Downing Street, with Conservatives calling on the government to abandon the European Human Rights Pact entirely. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has not ruled out changing the law in order to push forward with this policy, which would see the UK pay Rwanda some €150 million to take in asylum seekers.
Max Jarrett, let's take this from the top. Why Rwanda?
Well, Rwanda offered to do it. Rwanda's done this before. I mean, there are people from Libya who are, living in Rwanda as migrants and refugees, and they think they can do it. They can process people, and they feel that they're a country that's able to stand up to the obligations that they sign up to with the Brits on this.
Your thoughts on that, Laura Carter? Before we talk about last night's ruling, the fact that there is this deal between the UK and a country that's in the middle of Central Africa.
Yeah, I think perhaps from the UK's perspective, they see themselves as a sovereign nation making an agreement with another sovereign nation. But thinking about how it plays out to the UK public, Rwanda probably seems to most ordinary British people, a long way away, not somewhere that they've really thought about very much. So, potentially that plays into kind of Boris Johnson's plan to kind of take the problem away, take it out of Europe and kind of kick it into the long grass, which is basically what he does with a lot of issues we've seen.
Connor Tomlinson, it's kind of like sending people to Siberia. I mean, how will the people who are deported there ever go anywhere else?
Well, I think it's a bit of a harsh comparison to make, because that sounds almost like Soviet exile, where that was a severe punishment for people. Whereas Rwanda, and this is actually kind of the criticism of a lot of the left in Britain at the moment, it sort of smacks of a low bigotry of expectations of a country that has welcomed over 130,000 people from the Congo fleeing persecution. So I don't think it's like exiling to Siberia. And as far as the agreement goes, well, Rwanda were happy to take it, and we were actually taking in, and this is one of the concerns I have actually about the agreement, a technically unlimited number of vulnerable people from Rwanda that they want to send to us. So it's actually a mutual agreement overall, so I don't think it's fair to say it's like Siberia.
You mentioned there, and I'll put it to Max Jarrett quickly, taking in refugees from over the border. Of course, that goes both ways. Rwanda's taken stick a lot over the years over its human rights record. Its president's been in power effectively since 1994. And now with an uptick in the violence with the M23 rebellion in eastern Congo, which Kinshasa says is funded and fueled by Rwanda. What are the optics for Africans when they see that this is the country that the UK is doing business with?
Well, the optics for Africans is that the AU itself has said it's against this kind of procedure. Last year, when the Danes said they were doing it, the AU had a very, very strong statement saying European countries should not be shirking their responsibilities of processing asylum and refugees. So that's the first thing as far as Africans are concerned. Regarding Rwanda, Rwanda says that whatever's going on in Congo, it's not involved. It's dealing with those issues, but that's nothing to do with this particular situation. I think what we need to unpack in this is issues of politics, law, process, and pounds. The money. Where's the money really going to come from, and who's really going to benefit from all of this? And if we look at it very closely, I mean, in terms of the politics, this plays very well into your question regarding what Boris Johnson's Britain stands for, but I think you should be saying what Boris Johnson's government stands for. And that government has a base, and it had a Brexit that it wanted to deliver, and part of that is, of course, keeping the borders very, very tight and safe. So they want it, as my colleague was saying, they want any type of policy that can show that they're acting on that. And as you said, kicking things into the long grass. That's why they use Rwanda. It's as far away as possible in a way. So they thought, let's try and move this forward. And I think they're going to push this through because they say that Parliament is supreme, is sovereign.
Because there's dueling narratives when it comes to Rwanda itself. There's the narrative that this is an example of a country that since the genocide has picked itself up by its feet. It's become a tech hub for the region. It's when you go to Kigali, the streets are clean. It's a country that works. And then there's the narrative of a repressive regime. Yeah,
there are a lot of critics of the Rwandan regime who say that. The Rwandan regime itself has a very, very strong kind of PR on its side, saying that actually we're doing things right, we've picked up from the genocide and so forth, and all these things you're saying. But if we're looking at this particular situation, again, to come down to it, it's should people be sent to Rwanda? Well, people already have been going to Rwanda from North Africa. So that we should take that off the table in terms of saying whether Rwanda is fit for this. But given Rwanda's own record on other issues, there's justifiable concern about whether individuals who go to Rwanda might be, being sent to a place of vulnerability. That there are those concerns. But I think Rwanda says it can do it. It's struck a deal with the British government and it wants to do it. So let's see what happens.
And Rwanda's human rights records has been raising eyebrows in North London ever since 2018 when Kigali signed on to sponsor Arsenal Football Club, Arsenal, which sports the same Visit Rwanda logo that Paris Saint-Germain does as well. Laura Carter, I don't know how much of a football fan you are, but when you heard about this deal, Visit Rwanda, and again, PSG has the same one here in Paris.
Yeah, I mean, I used to live right by the Emirates in North London, so I guess I could call myself a football fan. I really agree that we need to separate the domestic politics of this issue from, Rwanda's own tourism and economic issues. Rwanda has the right just as much as any country to make a deal with another nation. What concerns me about this policy is exactly as my colleague said, we've got this endless take back control narrative that got Boris Johnson into power. if he's sort of hanging on in there, and it really feels like he's just doing anything to kind of reinforce that narrative with his kind of dwindling base. We're strong, we're powerful, we go against meddling bureaucratic European institutions. So in a way, the ruling again, it does play a bit into his favour, because those people who are anti-EU and support his government will just see it as another kind of reason that Britain needs to take back control and return to its sovereignty. And the questions of international law and international justice and the history of the European Human Rights Convention, they should be discussed, but they're not playing into this, because I think it's really solely linked to this narrative of finding a kind of post-Brexit Britain.
A post-Brexit Britain, and the UK Foreign Minister insisting that this is all in the name of neutralising people smugglers.
It's about establishing a principle and establishing a route to break the business model of the people traffickers who are causing untold misery and untold costs to the British economy.
Well, joining us from Heidelberg, Germany, is law professor Holger Hestermeyer of King's College London. Thanks for being with us here in the France 24 debate. Your reaction to Liz Truss's explanation of this scheme?
First of all, thanks for having me. I have very, very mixed feelings concerning this agreement. The first thing to say is it's not a binding agreement. It is a non-binding agreement, and that was one of the things that has been criticized. It is rather one-sided because the objective explicitly says this is about sending people from the UK to Rwanda, not the opposite way. Rwanda's record is mixed, and there is no evidence that this will actually deter people smugglers. And so I am quite skeptical and join the UNHCR in its concerns.
Quite skeptical, and at the same time, what do you do when it comes to discouraging people from crossing the channel at their peril?
The first thing is you establish the legal route that you insist people must take. That legal route is currently inaccessible, which is one of the things that has been criticized. And then you work together to deter the people smugglers. But to put the burden on the refugees is not the most appropriate choice.
Connor Tomlinson, you agree?
Absolutely not, because that implies that France is a country for which people need to seek asylum. And we can make all the jokes over in Britain about France as we might do, but it is our neighbour, our partner, and it is entirely safe. The issue we have in Britain, and this is, it's not just a take back control narrative, it is an issue of national sovereignty. And as the titular question said, how can we support Ukraine whilst also going against the European Convention on Human Rights? Ukraine's a question of national sovereignty as well. It did not deserve to be invaded by Russia. Putin is unequivocally wrong, and we condemn that, and we have taken action to support that. At the same time, Britain must have control of its borders in similar fashion. We are not being invaded by an invading force in terms of an army, but when you have multiple thousands of people coming across the channel, record numbers this year, without documentation, with mainly economic migrants, mainly fighting-age men, mainly people who like half of them are from Iran, which is a terrible country because of its repressive leaders, but it's not currently at war, then we do need, in some regards, to take back control, as it says. And if not, just for the economics and the numbers. I mean, if you look at a UK city, for example, the main things going up right now are student accommodation blocks and new hotels and flats, which are being immediately occupied by migrants, mainly across the sea, for £5 million a day. That is utterly unsustainable. We only have limited space despite our limitless compassion. And there's actually, sadly, a perverse incentive within the Conservative Party at the moment. For all the talk of Boris Johnson being a hard Brexiteer, he's done absolutely nothing about this. A record million migrants last year, legal and illegal. There's a perverse incentive to keep this going because 25% of the Conservative developers are property developers. So they like the high prices.
Hang on, you're adding in those million the people that are only the people that are going in. There are those going out as well. Laura Carter, what's it all? How big a problem is it right now in the UK migration?
Well, before answering that, I think I just want to say what's happening to these people is disgraceful. And when we have these conversations, we need to acknowledge that these people crossing the channel in boats have been through things that I don't think any of us can even imagine. So handing them papers and sending them to another country is already kind of a pretty disgraceful thing to people who have already suffered fundamentally. How big a problem is it in the UK? I mean, there is pressure on public services, there is pressure on housing, but at the same time, the National Health Service is run and staffed by migrants and has been for the last 70 years. So, I mean, I think obviously migrants, economic migrants, refugees and asylum seekers are different, but this is a complicated problem. And I really don't think that we should be mixing the policies of this government with the views of the British people, their compassion, their opinions, because I think that's really mixed. They feel pressure on public services, but it's not refugees coming across the channel who are putting predominantly pressure on those services. It's a whole range of demographic issues and
well, let me ask you then,
Europe.
Laura, about the mood, because last weekend's news cycle in the UK was consumed by remarks by the future King of England. The Times of London quoting Prince Charles telling a source privately that the Rwandan deportation scheme was, quote, appalling. Right-wing British tabloids like the Mail on Sunday quick to turn on the Prince of Wales. This was the front page. We will not back down on Rwanda. Charles, pretty obvious there. But what's the mood in Britain right now?
I think it's mixed. Polling suggests it's mixed on this policy, and it's changing very rapidly. I mean, most people on the surface think it's pretty appalling, but also people can understand that we have to find a solution to this problem. I'm not denying that. But I think the solution needs to be found in Europe with partners in Europe, and other international partners. But the route the UK government's going, I think, is probably going away from the kind of majority public opinion. Yes, we need to find a solution, but if you actually think about these individuals and what they're going through, what they've been through, and then what they're facing being deported to a country that they never planned to be in the first place, I think we need to come back to questions of compassion, especially when it's a case of kind of 7 individuals who were put on that flight. Let's think a little bit about what these people have been through just to try and make a safe life for themselves.
Rwanda, Max Jarrett, a country that has a conflicted history with France, particularly with its role during the 1994 genocide. What's the view of people when they watch Britain's policy in this regards towards? Is it the same thing? Is it the former colonial power that they're looking at, or like we heard that businessman in that report saying, this was a chance to do business together too?
People where, Francois? What's the view of people where? People in the street in Rwanda, people in Monrovia, where I was born, people in Addis Ababa? I mean, what are you asking?
I mean, I'm asking in sub-Saharan Africa, generally, what's the view, especially in former British colonies? Why do they see this?
The view is, as I said, the African Union, which speaks for the continent, has said it's against this kind of policy, that Britain should be processing these people on British soil because it signed up to the 1951 convention, and deal with it that way. To be pushing things to other countries, most Africans feel is wrong. Don't forget, Africa deals with many more migrants than many other countries. I mean, so many people are processed in African countries, and African countries don't often have the money for it. So I think the view would be that, okay, in this particular case, the Rwandan gentleman we heard earlier said that we'll be getting money out of it. There are also some people might say that migrants are good in the way that they come, they bring this energy, and maybe they can contribute to as entrepreneurs to our society. But the overwhelming view of many people is the one that really Britain should be dealing with this in its own way. And I guess Britain says it's doing that, but on British soil. Don't be pushing this back to Africa.
Holger Hestermeyer, it's been now, 7 years since we had that giant migrant crisis. Actually, what am I saying? It's more than 7 years. It's closer to 9 years that we had a giant migrant crisis in Europe. One of the motors for the Brexit referendum that followed. Have we gotten any better at any of this?
No, I think we are still very easily captured by a lack of nuance and a discourse that just entirely dehumanizes the migrants. And in this context, I do have to correct some things. There's no evidence that the majority of the people arriving are economic migrants. Britain, as a proud sovereign nation, has signed the European Convention on Human Rights, and my image of Britain as a proud sovereign nation is that it stands by its commitments and not that it disregards them as an act of sovereignty. The right exercise of sovereignty is to stand by your commitments, which is also important in the Ukraine context, because Russia and Belarus precisely do not stand by their commitments in the European Convention of Human Rights. My vision of the UK is that we set an example, and that example must be the opposite behavior. So I think we have not yet quite learned from the migrant crisis. We should be able to deal with migrant crises and offer refugees a future because we have compassion, and not as an act of compassion set them into a plane and fly them elsewhere.
But how, without that so-called pull factor?
The first thing to recognize is that many of these migrants come because of appalling circumstances. They do not come because of pull factors. They come because their life has been made impossible. They do not have a choice. I have lived in countries with very difficult circumstances, such as Mexico, but people did not want to leave. Only if your life is made impossible do you really leave in large numbers. And the pull factor then no longer plays a role, and then we have to find solutions, and those solutions must take account of those human beings.
You mentioned the European Convention of Human Rights. It's part of the court that made that ruling is part of it. It was enshrined in UK law in 1998 by the then Labour government of Tony Blair. 1998, the year of the Good Friday Agreements, which brought peace to Northern Ireland after 3 decades of bloodshed, as reminded by this tweet sent out by Ireland's EU Affairs Minister. He says, before some UK politicos start talking about renouncing the ECHR, can I remind them that while it's not an EU institution, the ECHR is expressly embedded in the Good Friday Agreement and in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement with the EU. So, Conor Tomlinson, are you in favor of walking away from the ECHR?
I am. I think it's going to be some pretty difficult legal framework with the Good Friday Agreement. I know that the current debates that Liz Truss is having about the bill, there's legal framework in there to adjust that and make sure that there's not so many goods and services checks on goods going inside of UK's actual trade border, because a lot of the Northern Irish goods that even aren't going to the EU side of Ireland are being checked over many times, and it means that the Northern Irish economy is really suffering. But the problem is also the 1951 UN Convention on Refugees. I mean, it defines refugees as people who are either unable or unwilling to leave their return to their country, and it's also about political opinions. So they're incredibly subjective parameters for what constitutes a refugee, which has meant that there's a large influx of people who are disproportionately using the National Health Service, for example. I'm wrong on that. And it's also people who are using it at the point of service. And the idea that Britain isn't honouring its commitments, well, I think we should honour commitments which are properly made and properly thought out. Number one, Tony Blair was a terrible Prime Minister and has done a lot of harm to this country, not least of all the suppression of freedom of speech under Section 127 of the Communications Act. And that's actually partially what's baked into the UN's definition of human rights. They actually changed their article on freedom of expression to allow people to be censored under the basis of public good. And that was in 1948. And the reason for that is the Soviet Union complained. So if we're talking about Britain holding up its standards to fight off Russia, I think the UN should take a good look in the mirror, first of all, of its own existing laws. And actually, the UK should...
Getting back to the original question, Conor, you're saying that basically Britain has the right to cherry pick which of the treaties it's signed it adheres to.
I think Britain, in its successive changing governments and different values and political opinions, has the right to update legislation because it's not some sort of iron law descended from God. We should pick and choose and amend policies when they need amending. And clearly, if over 1 million people are coming here legally every year, plus extra people we don't understand legally, and financially we're crumbling, something isn't working.
Laura Carter.
I just think we've got to ask, what is the end game here? If we start walking away from things, okay, we left the EU, fine, it's done. We've all said it's done. But if we start talking about walking away from the European Convention on Human Rights, which goes against things like slavery and torture, I mean, really, is that the future that Boris Johnson wants to lead Britain into? Yes, we can have sovereign policies. We can think about our immigration policy, but leaving the Council of Europe and abandoning the European Court of Human Rights is, to me, it's kind of like it signals something really drastic about where he wants to take this country. And the thing that I find most kind of shocking and slightly depressing is I don't think he really even has a plan. I think he's just reacting to things. I think he's got people around him who are enabling him, and he just wants to stay in power. But making those kinds of huge decisions about Britain's role in the world, I mean, yeah, it's pretty drastic.
Max Jarrett, you worked in a previous life at the United Nations, multilateral institutions. They were the target of a lot of the blowback against globalization that we have seen over the last decade. Here in France, it's the election campaigns right now, and the far left and the far right candidates are calling for the right to overrule when they see fit EU decisions. Your thoughts on, is this a British problem or a worldwide problem?
It's a worldwide problem. Well, it's a worldwide challenge. I wouldn't say problem. I'm with Connor on this in terms of a sovereign state and the people who elect a government have a right to look at decisions that have been made in the past and put into law at any stage, right? But it's an issue of process here. Now, if you've signed up to a law internationally and you've been abiding by that, don't then say you're not going to apply by it unless you already have changed your domestic law to say you don't accept that anymore. When it still exists, and then you're saying you're not going to abide by it, that to me is a problem. Now, so it's a global problem in terms of different countries looking at trying to find scapegoats like the UN and so forth. That's been going for many, many years. I remember when I worked with Kofi Annan, he said, people always say that the UN is the whipping boy or so forth. But if we didn't have a UN, what would we have? You do need to have these multilateral institutions. Of course, they have to be fit for purpose. But we need to have some kind of forum in which we come together, laws and norms that we all abide by, so that we don't have basically a crazy world. And I'm really concerned right now because we are in a very, very crazy space. And I want to put this to Laura, the historian. Are we now essentially 1922 to 32, or are we now just trying to tweak 45 to 55?
We're not yet in a kind of post or during World War situation, are we? We've seen a lot of conflicts. We've got conflicts in Europe right now where you've got to think about things like the United Nations and the European Convention of Human Rights were signed in the context of a post-war world. So certainly, I hesitate to ever make direct comparisons between the present moment and, for example, the interwar period or the post-war period that you said. I mean, I think it's probably more helpful to think about things in terms of, perhaps a turn away from that globalization that we saw at the end of the century and a reassertion of nationalism that we've seen in lots of ways. But, we have still, as you said, got all these international organizations and European-wide organizations that have to matter because this migrant question is a European question. And yes, there are links with the places that the migrants are coming from, but it's not something that Britain can just solve on its own by changing its laws. It just isn't.
Holger Hestemeyer, we have, again, I go back to Ukraine. We have calls from not just Britain, but also the United States for Russia to be brought before international justice over atrocities and war crimes committed in Ukraine. But the U.S. is not a member of the International Criminal Court. It imposes extraterritoriality for its own laws, but doesn't recognize international justice. So where does that leave international justice in today's world?
In fact, that is a really, really difficult problem. I think the first thing is, of course, a country has the sovereign right to terminate treaties. But if we want to cooperate and if we don't want to be perceived as hypocritical, and if we want to convince others, we have to lead by example. And you can see the effect of that not happening in countries like India that rightly point out the contradictions in many of the policies of the West, that we want Russia to be put before the ICC, or rather individuals in Russia to be put before the ICC, but at the same time, the US is not willing to do the same thing itself. So I think we have to learn to lead by example again, and that will be difficult at times, but ultimately it is the right thing to do. And if this does not happen, cooperation will become more and more difficult, and you see that in a lot of international fora at the moment. You see it in the World Trade Organization, you see it in the ICC, you see it in the United Nations. International cooperation is getting more difficult, and we have to change that again because we thoroughly need international cooperation for all of the problems that we currently face.
Why is it becoming more difficult?
First of all, because a lot of the countries that before didn't have a voice have gained a voice and are now expressing their opinions, and their opinions are truly their own. And they don't necessarily concur with us, and we still haven't quite learned to listen to them. And I refer in particular to India now in the conflict with Ukraine. India has its own position, its own ideas, and we speak mostly of India as a third person without agency that needs to be convinced. We need to discuss with India and include it in our considerations, and I think that is the right approach to cooperation and to ultimately achieving results. And the same is true for the African Union, that is often sidelined, and for Latin America.
True, Max Jarrett, they have more clout, and therefore you can't just dismiss them, and it becomes harder as a result of when you're in the room.
I don't think they have more clout yet. They have more voice and increasingly more influence. But I think if we're questioning things, let's question everything. Let's question Bretton Woods.
Bretton Woods, just to remind our viewers, is when they decided to make the World Bank and the International Monetary
Fund. Yes, and the voice, and
right after World War II.
Yeah, and that right now is the U.S. Official always heads that, and a European always heads the IMF. Let's question Security Council seats. Africans asking for that. It's asking for that. Let's question the G20. The African Union is not in the G20. If you put Africa together as one bloc, it's about 1 billion people. It's not at the G20. Let's question everything then, and together come towards some kind of consensus of how we want to go forward. That's why I was talking about when I was mentioning whether in 1922 to 32, where it was just after Woodrow Wilson, the League of Nations, or after 45, where the world really came together, United Nations, they had Liberia was part of that, Ethiopia, most other African countries were not, but then trying to think through how do we now move forward, to create a world in which we all try and get along a bit better. So let's question everything, question Bretton Woods, let's question the Security Council and reach some kind of new agreement. Because you can't have states which say, no, Bretton Woods is not for discussion, Security Council is not for discussion, but yet regarding the Geneva, the 51 Treaty, we're going to change, we want to change that. Regarding some of the EU things, we want to change that. Well, then,
I think a lot of the power dynamics underlying all the treaties and institutions you're talking about go back to questions of empire and colonialism, don't they? I mean, who if you're talking about the period after the First World War, most European nations were still imperial powers. They were decolonizing after the Second World War. So, if you really want to kind of deconstruct those places and think about those power dynamics, you've got to acknowledge, well, what do we owe these countries actually after what we took from them historically? So it's a big question.
Connor Tomlinson, Maximilian Jarrett making the point that the rules of international institutions, well, they were written by the winners of World War II. If there is a questioning, if there's a tearing up of the rules or a rewrite of the rules, is that in the interest of Britain?
It depends on if the rules, as I said before, are particularly legitimate. I don't think the UN's free expression rule is particularly strong. I don't think its definition of refugees is particularly strong. I think those should be strengthened. And what was just said there about questioning the International Monetary Fund, about bringing in Africa as essentially a trading bloc into the G20, I bloody applaud that. I think it's fantastic, especially because that's the only way we can stabilise these countries and stop people fleeing them.
And Britain's veto power at the Security Council being watered down, would you applaud that as well?
Well, I don't know about veto power at the Security Council, just because, I mean, honestly, a lot of these countries that get a lot of sway over it. I mean, you mentioned India before. It's all well and good for India to criticise us, but when they're still buying oil from Russia in their native currency and propping up their economy, that's not great either. Neither is their trade links to China. So if we're talking about countries having hypocritical human rights abuses awards, I don't think it's best to look to Britain for that. I think it's to look to a lot of the other countries that are wielding a lot of influence around the world.
Laura Carter?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone, on human rights records, I think Britain and historically stands up and thinks of itself as this kind of like fair playing by the rules, as you said at the beginning, a kind of a bastion of liberal democracy. And I really think some of the things that have been happening recently under this government are really starting to kind of question and change that narrative. And the reason I say this is because, and I'm going to make the point again about distinguishing between this government and kind of British people, the British population, because there are stories that the Brits tell about themselves that hinge on things like the Second World War, welcoming refugees from Europe, from the Spanish Civil War, from Nazi-occupied Germany. And those things are, I think, at the fore of people's mind when we make this kind of hard shift. I mean, the optics of this.
Well, it's even
really
today
not
because
great.
there's the welcoming of Ukrainian refugees.
Right, which is something that looks good for Boris Johnson and kind of plays into kind of how the population feel, I think. But in the case of migrants crossing the channel, who, as I said, are in appalling circumstances and have been through appalling things, I don't really understand why. I mean, I have some theories about why they might be different, but yeah.
All right, and there's the Rwanda deportation scheme. There's also last week's tabling of a bill in the British Parliament to ignore the Irish Sea trade border. Britain signed on to respect the European Commission this Wednesday, launching 2 new legal proceedings and resuming a third over Boris Johnson's refusal to honour that post-Brexit deal that he signed.
Respecting the European Court of Justice rulings would be just piling one breach of the international law upon another. Does the UK want to go in that direction? Is it compatible with the proud British traditions of upholding and respecting the rule of law and international law in that regard?
Conor Thomason, the British Prime Minister promised global Britain that there would be great trade deals signed with many parts of the world. Can Britain be trusted, though?
Well, Liz Truss did sign a great amount of trade deals with a great many number of countries. I'm not a big fan of the TPP, for example, because I do think it conflicts with environmental goals, because it forces you to buy oil from member countries, and then you can be sued for not buying the oil, but you can't break the contract. So that seems utterly ridiculous to me. I think the main problem with Britain is actually its domestic economic policy. As Laurie then said about the policies enacted under this government for human rights concerns, I have major issues with lockdown and a lot of the economic policies conducted under there, and them, and especially the international financial institutions like the IMF, decided to print money en masse and devalue our domestic currency, also making it a more difficult place for the people who are genuine refugees and asylum seekers like Hong Kong and Ukraine to integrate into. It's very expensive over here. So I think Britain can be a global Britain, but it has to stop sabotaging its own domestic economy first.
Sweet. Hong Kong and Ukraine, what about places like Afghanistan? What about places like Eritrea?
Afghanistan, we do actually have a fair amount of people coming over because we signed an exclusive deal there. I think America is more at fault than us there because they botched the withdrawal, thank you to President Biden. The main issue is with the channel migrants is the majority of those are not from those countries. Again, about 50% of them are from Iran. And let's put it this way, if you're taking in lots and lots of people who are going to be dependent on the state's healthcare system, need housing immediately at the point of access, then you're actually taking away resources from the vital refugees like Hong Kong, like Ukraine, which we feel a rightful obligation to help.
Holger Estermeyer, how does international law stand when it comes to good refugees and bad refugees?
Yes, international law, of course, does not distinguish here. And I want to point out that in terms of being welcoming to Ukrainian refugees, there have been problems with UK procedures. So the UK has, according to the statistics of the UNHCR, welcomed 70,000 refugees, which is a large number. But compared to the Czech Republic, compared to Germany, Turkey, Italy, Spain, France, Bulgaria, and even Austria, it is a smaller number. So I think, and of course, not to speak of the neighboring countries, Poland, of course, has welcomed a large number of refugees. International law does not provide for a distinction here. But to come back to the point you made initially about the Northern Ireland Protocol, 1 year ago I would have said that questions of Brexit can be sequestered and treated separately, and the UK will not become a less reliable partner because there are political shenanigans surrounding Brexit. Partners will be well aware that Brexit is special. And nowadays, I'm no longer that sure, because a lot of the arguments made carry over to other areas. So in the context of the Northern Ireland Protocol, there is now the myth that international law does not exist and does not bind you. That, of course, is a very, very dangerous myth. International law does exist and it is binding. And you need to find reasons in international law if you want to depart from your obligations, or you need to terminate an agreement.
And what are the consequences for the UK if they go down this road?
I think it will be that partners have to evaluate more thoroughly what bits of an agreement might be attacked because of populist political reasons and what bits might not, and you have to protect them and ring fence them and think of more solid procedures of dispute resolution and more solid procedures of countermeasures.
Yeah, Laura Carter, you said at the outset that a lot of this is domestic politics. There's a bit of grandstanding. It's got to do with domestic arguments. Boris Johnson himself is in a lot of hot water personally. Therefore, there's all these domestic politics that go into it. But how should the rest of Europe react? Do we care about any of that stuff?
Well, I think I have to agree with my colleague and say it just keeps bringing us back to Brexit, doesn't it? I mean, the trying to understand why Britain is making some quite extraordinary decisions, positioning itself in the way it is. I do think it comes back to the narrative that got Boris Johnson in power, that he believes will keep him in power, and that has a lot to do with being this island nation who takes back control, et cetera, et cetera. And I can't speak for the rest of Europe, but I think looking at Britain, even just from France, we do come back to that issue of Brexit. Picking these fights, not necessarily being willing to kind of uphold things that you've said you were going to do and negotiate when it comes to the European Union. I mean, the British tabloids, they love it. They love any kind of argument with the EU. You have no idea. They love it, and it plays exactly to the Conservative base and the Tory-funded press. I mean, I really think, I'm not even sure there's that much literacy in the UK around the difference between the European Court of Human Rights that we've been talking about today and the European Union, because the European Court of Human Rights...
So this is never going away?
I don't know. I seriously hope it goes away. I seriously hope the issue around the Northern Ireland Protocol is solved in a way that is good for the people of Northern Ireland and the people of Republic of Ireland. But, I can't help but think there's some serious kind of petty politics still going on there.
Conor Tomlinson, fortunately, you have a win-win answer for Northern Ireland.
How so?
Well, you're going to tell us now. Go ahead.
Well, I think that you're going to amend it within the legal framework. I think there's going to be a lot of contention, specifically because the EU would like to levy a lot of border goods, because they are trying to punish the UK for Brexit. No matter my misgivings with how Brexit went off, even though I support it, I think it was badly done, especially because of Theresa May and Boris Johnson, etc. But I think what you're going to have to do
here it's pretty clear cut. You've got the Good Friday agreements, so therefore the Good Friday agreements stipulate an open border between the two Irelands. How do you do it?
Open border between the two islands, I'm not really sure on if that's going to allay the tensions between the two countries, particularly because of Ireland's domestic policies. You have the Democratic Unionist Party and Sinn Féin constantly at each other's throats, and they still haven't really allocated their top premier yet because they can't really decide on that. So I think actually you're probably going to be able to see a little bit of conflict within Ireland and see if they want to push for a reunification and a split movement from the UK, much like Scotland's going to try to. And I think the business is not going to be great, especially because the UK is now setting up in order to use the green lane for UK goods, you're going to have to be authenticated as a British trader. So it's going to seriously annoy a lot of small independent traders within Northern Ireland as well. So I actually don't think it's going to be a fix-all.
All right, so this is the gift that keeps on giving, a consensus on that point. Maximilian Jarrett. Yeah,
just want to return to your question about trust. Over 40 years ago, when I first went to the UK as a young man to go to school, I was told that, we in England, we don't have a constitution, it's unwritten and so forth, and so many things are done just on trust. An Englishman, if he shakes your hand, then it's a done deal. Well, today, even if he writes it and signs it, most of us who weren't born in Britain don't feel that's a deal anymore. This issue of trust, it's been ripped up.
What happened?
Well, Brexit. Since Brexit, so many things are up in the air now. Many people don't trust, especially the Tory government under Boris Johnson. It's just a fact. They don't trust they're going to do what they say they're going to do, even though they
Is it about one man, or is it something that is broken?
I don't know what's broken, but I think right now, if we look at this particular situation, there are many people. You heard what the European Union Commissioner said. Is Britain the nation that we always thought it was? Or is it now a case where they sign up to things and then the next day they say they're not going to do it? So there are questions about whether Britain can be trusted. I wouldn't even want to say Britain, whether this particular government can be trusted.
Very briefly, Holger Hestermeyer, is it a question of one government or one man, or is there a bigger problem here?
I think there is a problem in the initial construction of Brexit, in the term that there was a decision to leave the EU, but there was no decision on what would come afterwards. And the blockade that produced, the fact that the population was so utterly split and Parliament was so utterly split, led to a radicalization of the Conservative Party to push through the initial policy of Brexit. And I think that means that now the government is beholden to a rather radicalized base, which makes everything more problematic, because this is clearly no longer very conservative when you see radical ideas being pushed about every 5 days. Throw out the Lord Spirituals of the House of Lords because we disagree with them. Let's leave the European Convention on Human Rights, even though 2 days ago we said that the Good Friday Agreement needs to be protected, and the Good Friday Agreement refers to the European Convention on Human Rights. So I think the problem here is a smaller and smaller base that is vital for political power and that actors have to base themselves on. And this problem is hopefully eventually going away. At least I continue to be optimistic.
All right, we'll leave on that optimistic note. Holger Estemeyer, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Heidelberg. I want to thank as well Connor Tomlinson in London, Laura Carter, Maximilian Jarrett. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.